She was sold for £4,000 in a cold assembly room in Yorkshire before 50 witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives insisting they had pitied her. But pity was the last thing she required from them. Pity was, in fact, the very thing she had come there to ruin. She had nothing. He had everything. Society said the distance between them was a law of nature, fixed as the stars, and that a woman who had fallen so far could never rise to meet a man who stood so high. But society had made one error, the same error it always made with women like her. It had mistaken silence for weakness. It had mistaken a bowed head for a broken one. And when a woman has spent 4 years keeping the ledgers of her own family's ruin, watching every figure, learning every name, understanding precisely who profited from her fall, she does not arrive at the auction block as a victim. She arrives as the only person in the room who knows exactly what is about to happen. Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest, and where the women society tried to silence become the most dangerous forces in England. I have been waiting to share this one with you because it is not the story you think it is. It looks, at first, like the tale of a woman who was bought. It is, in truth, the story of a woman who set a trap, and of the one man in England who walked into it and refused to play the part she had written for him. But before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Whether you are curled beneath a warm blanket as the rain comes down, or stealing a quiet hour on a long commute, or moving through the small tasks of your evening with this story for company, I want to know. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. I read every single one, and this community of ours, stretching from one end of the earth to the other, is the reason I keep telling these tales. Tonight's story is about a woman who kept the accounts of her own destruction, column by column, in a careful hand, knowing exactly what the numbers meant long before any man thought to explain them to her. And it is about the man who walked into the worst night of her life and paid a fortune, not to own her, but because he had loved her so long and so silently that he could not bear to watch the wrong man win the thing she had made of herself. Chapter 1. The Block. Let me take you to Yorkshire, in the grey and dwindling autumn of 1856, where the rain came sideways off the moors and the great houses lit their fires early against the dark. This is where we find her, standing on a raised step at the front of the Harrogate assembly rooms, the eyes of the gathered gentry crawling over her like the first frost of the season. She kept her chin level. She kept her gaze fixed on a water stain that bloomed brown above the doorway, because she had learned in the long months of her humiliation that the only thing they could not take from a woman was the place she chose to look. The auctioneer's voice rolled out across the room, fat, with a relish he did not trouble to hide. £4,000. £4,000 to his Grace the Duke of Hawthorne. Do I hear more? No? Then the matter is concluded. Going once. She did not look toward the voice that had spoken the bid. She would not give the room the satisfaction of watching her search for the man who had just changed the shape of her plan. She knew only that the voice had come from the rear of the hall, low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. Going twice. To her left, a woman tittered behind a painted fan. Annabel Foss knew that sound intimately. She had heard it for 6 months, ever since the world learned what her father had done. It was the sound of pity wearing the mask of delight, the laughter of people congratulating themselves on not being her. Sold. The word closed over her like cold water. And in the silence that followed, while the room buzzed and craned and whispered, Annabel allowed herself one single thought, fierce and private, behind her composed and frozen face. That was not supposed to be you. but to understand how a gentleman's daughter came to stand upon a step in the Harrogate assembly rooms, to understand the scale of what she had lost, and the precision of the trap she had laid, and the strangeness of the man who had sprung it, we must go back, 6 months earlier, to a spring that seemed at the time like any other. Now, it is important that you understand what a woman's circumstances truly were in 1856, because every choice Annabel made was carved out of these hard facts. A gentlewoman could not earn her bread in any respectable fashion. She could not, in the eyes of the law, hold money of her own once she married. Under the doctrine of coverture, husband and wife were considered a single legal person, and that person was the husband. Her property became his property. Her very wages, had she been permitted to earn any, would have become his. An unmarried daughter lived wholly upon the fortune of her father, and through him upon the decisions of men she had no right to question. When a father gambled, his daughter did not gamble. But when he lost, she lost everything: her home, her name, her place in the only world she had ever known. The Married Women's Property Act, which would one day grant women some small measure of independence, lay more than 20 years in the future. In 1856, a woman like Annabel Foss owned precisely nothing, not even herself. And yet there was one thing the law had never thought to forbid a woman, because the law had never imagined a woman would want it. The law had never forbidden her to understand, and Annabel Foss understood everything. She had begun keeping her father's accounts at 18, in the grey months after her mother died, when Sir Reginald Foss discovered that grief and brandy made poor companions for arithmetic. I want you to picture how it began, because it began so gently, the way the worst things often do. A daughter at a desk on a winter evening, a single lamp, a column of figures her father could no longer bear to face. She had thought she was sparing him. She had not understood that first night that she was teaching herself the one skill that would one day save her life. It became, over 4 years, something far more dangerous than a kindness. It became a complete and unsparing knowledge of exactly how a comfortable family is destroyed. She knew the dates. She knew the sums. She knew the names of the men who sat across the green baize tables at the gentlemen's clubs in Leeds and York, and let her father lose night after night because a grieving baronet who could not stop was the most profitable creature in England. 2 names appeared more often than the rest. The first was Mr. Josiah Pell, a moneylender of respectable dress and unrespectable methods. Pell did not gamble himself. Pell merely waited at the edge of the table like a patient tide, and leant against the losses and watched the debt swell into something that could swallow a family whole. Annabel had once calculated on a sleepless night the true rate of the interest Pell charged her father, working it out to the farthing by the light of a guttering candle. When she arrived at the figure, she had sat very still for a long while, because she understood then that she was not watching bad luck. She was watching a machine, and the machine had been built on purpose, and her father was the coal it burned. The second name was Mr. Crispin Vane. Now, I have to pause here and tell you something, because when I first sketched out this story, Vane was the character who gave me the most trouble. It would have been so easy to make him a simple brute, but the truly dangerous men of that era were rarely brutes. They were charming, they were patient, and Crispin Vane was both. He was the younger son of a baronet, handsome in the cold and careful way of men who have practiced their own faces in mirrors, and he had spent 2 years circling Annabel Foss with an attentiveness the neighbourhood mistook for courtship. Let me show you the man, because you must understand him to understand her. He came to call one afternoon in that final spring, when the Foss fortunes were already failing and the better families had already begun, quietly, to forget the Fosses existed. Vane did not forget them. Vane arrived with hothouse flowers and sat in their fading parlour as though it were the finest room in the county. and he watched Annabel pour the tea with an expression she had come, over 2 years, to read precisely. "You manage your father's household beautifully, Miss Foss," he said, accepting his cup. "Better, I think, than your father manages it himself. I have often observed it. There is a—" He paused, choosing the word the way a man chooses a blade from a case. "A competence to you. It is unusual. Some men would find it unwomanly. I find it remarkable." "You are kind to say so," Annabel said, and gave him nothing. "I am never kind," said Vane pleasantly. "I am accurate. There is a difference, and a clever woman knows it." He sipped his tea. "Your father's situation grows difficult, I think. These things have a way of gathering. A woman in such a position must consider her future with some care. She cannot afford sentiment. She must think, as you so clearly can think, about what arrangement might best secure her." He set down the cup. "I am a man who admires a mind that can keep accounts. I should like you to remember that, Miss Foss, when the accounts grow hard to balance. I should like you to remember that there is one man at least who sees exactly what you are worth." And he smiled, and Annabel smiled back, and behind her smile she heard the threat for exactly what it was. Because she had seen Crispin Vane's name in her father's ledgers. She had seen the dates on which Vane had quietly purchased portions of Sir Reginald's debt from Josiah Pell, gathering up the strands of the family's ruin into his own patient hands. Vane was not courting her in spite of her downfall. He was engineering it. He intended to become the man who owned the debt, so that he might present himself as the only man who could forgive it, and name his price. And the price, she understood, was her. Not as a wife in any sense she would recognize. As a possession that could keep his accounts and warm his bed and never, ever be able to leave him. Because a ruined woman has nowhere to go. He had no idea she could read a ledger. He had no idea she had seen his name there in her own neat hand. That was his single, fatal error. And it was the same error the whole of Yorkshire made. He could not imagine a woman as a threat. So you see, by the spring of 1856, Annabel Foss stood at the centre of a web she understood entirely. Her father, blind and drowning, owed everything. Pell held the paper. Vane was buying it, and the whole of Yorkshire society, sipping its tea and tittering behind its fans, believed her to be a poor, doomed, foolish girl who would soon be grateful to marry anyone at all. It was the cruelest position imaginable. And it was, Annabel slowly realized, the most powerful position she had ever occupied in her life, if only she had the nerve to use it. "I know what you are thinking. You are thinking that no woman in 1856 could have done anything at all with such knowledge, that she had no money, no standing, no power. And you are right that she had none of those things. But she had the one weapon the powerful never guard against, because they cannot imagine the powerless possessing it. She had information. She had 4 years of meticulous records proving exactly who had done what and when and for how much. And she had grasped a truth that would carry her through everything to come. The men who had ruined her had done so in the comfortable belief that no one was keeping count. Someone had been keeping count. She had been keeping count the entire time. The plan came to her on a wet night in April, while she sat at her father's desk with the ledger open before her and a single candle guttering low. Sir Reginald was asleep in his chair by the cold grate, an empty glass loose in his fingers, his head fallen sideways, his breath whistling. Annabel looked at him for a long moment with an emotion too complicated to be called love and too old to be called anger. Then she looked down at the names in her own neat hand. Pell, Vane, the long roll of the men who had fed on her family. And a thought arrived in her, fully formed and terrible and clear. They believed they were going to sell her. Very well. She would let them sell her. But she would choose the manner of the sale, and she would make certain that every man who had profited from her ruin was standing in the room when the truth came out. It was Vane himself who handed her the shape of it, not 3 weeks later at a card party at the Pell residence. The air there was thick with cigar smoke and the false warmth of men enjoying another's misfortune. Sir Reginald had lost again, badly, publicly, a sum that drew a low whistle from the table. And in the ugly silence that followed, Crispin Vane rose, smiling, and proposed what he called a solution. He spoke of it as a jest, the way cruel men speak their truest intentions while preserving the option of denial. "Come, Foss, do not look so stricken," he said, swirling his glass. "A gentleman of resource has more than coin to settle a debt. You have a daughter, do you not? A daughter of marriageable age and, I am told, remarkable competence." A ripple of laughter, ugly and uncertain, moved around the table. "Present her properly to the gentlemen of the county. Let them bid for the privilege. I dare say she would fetch enough to clear your slate entirely. I dare say," and here he glanced just once toward the doorway where Annabel stood pale and silent, having come to fetch her father home, "she would fetch a very great deal." The men laughed because it was monstrous, and because they were the sort of men who laughed at monstrous things to prove they were untroubled by them. Sir Reginald made a feeble sound of protest and reached for his glass instead. But Annabel did not laugh. Annabel went very still, and behind her still face she thought, with a clarity that frightened even her, yes, because an auction required a room. An auction required every interested party to be present, in person at the same hour, with their intentions made plain before witnesses. An auction was the one circumstance in all the world in which she could gather Pell and Vane and her father and the whole watching county into a single space, and then, at the moment of their greatest confidence, take the floor. She went to Vane 3 days later, and I will not pretend to you that it cost her nothing. It cost her more than almost anything she ever did. To walk into the parlour of the man she most despised and let him believe he had broken her, to lower her eyes, to soften her voice, to perform the surrender he hungered to see, she felt it like a stone swallowed whole. She told him she understood her situation. She told him she would not shame her father by refusing the arrangement he proposed. She asked only that it be done with some semblance of dignity. A proper assembly, the gentlemen of the county invited, the sums recorded openly in a public manner, so that no man might later claim he had been cheated. Vane, who believed he was watching a proud woman break upon the wheel of her circumstances, granted her every condition, with the magnanimity of a man who has already won. "You are sensible, Miss Foss," he said, taking her hand before she could prevent it and pressing it between his own. "I knew you would be. I have always known what you were." His thumb moved across her knuckles, and it took everything she had not to snatch the hand away. "When this unpleasant business is concluded, you will find I am not an ungenerous man to those who please me." He should have wondered why a woman walking to her own ruin cared so much that the books be kept openly. He should have wondered why she wanted witnesses, why she, of all people, wished the whole county gathered to watch her shame. But Crispin Vane could not imagine a woman as a threat, and that failure of imagination was the crack into which Annabel Foss intended to drive everything she had. What she did not account for, what no plan, however careful, could account for, was a man named Cedric, the Duke of Hawthorne. And here, my friends, is where the story turns from cold calculation into something with a heartbeat, because the Duke of Hawthorne had loved Annabel Foss for 16 years and had never once told a living soul. Let me take you back further still for just a moment, because you cannot understand what he did in that assembly room unless you understand what came before. Long before he was a duke, before the war, before the title fell to him through the deaths of an uncle and 2 cousins he had scarcely known, Cedric had been a boy of 11, the unregarded son of a minor branch of the family, sent one summer to a Yorkshire cousin's estate because his own parents found him tiresome. He had been a serious, watchful child, the sort that adults forget in corners, and it was in one of those corners, at a children's party he had not wanted to attend, that he first saw Annabel Foss. She had been 6 years old. A much larger boy had been tormenting a smaller one, twisting his arm and laughing, and tiny Annabel Foss had marched directly into the middle of it and informed the larger boy, in a voice of perfect 6-year-old fury, that he was a coward, and that cowards always lost in the end. The boy had shoved her down into the mud. She had stood up, mud-streaked, furious, entirely undefeated, and informed him that she had been proved correct because now everyone could see exactly what he was. And Cedric, 11 years old and invisible in his corner, had felt something turn over in his chest that he would spend the better part of 2 decades failing to name. He never spoke to her. That was the tragedy of him. The thing the war would make worse, and the title would make impossible. He was a watcher. He saw everything and reached for nothing. His visits to Yorkshire grew rare. The title came down upon him like a landslide. And then there was Crimea. Now I must tell you something of that war, because it made the man. The Crimean War, which England fought against Russia from 1853, was a catastrophe of a particular and modern kind. More men died of disease and cold and the criminal incompetence of their commanders than ever fell to enemy fire. The names that came home, the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava, the slaughter at Inkerman, the long frozen horror of the siege of Sevastopol, became bywords for waste, for valor spent on nothing by men who deserved better than the generals who spent them. Cedric went as a man of rank, and came home a man of silences, with a scar that ran pale from temple to jaw, and a stillness that strangers mistook for coldness. He had learned in the siege lines before Sevastopol that the things you love are taken from you the instant you reach for them, and that the safest love is the love you never name. He returned to England in 1855, a duke, a hero in the newspapers, and a man who had built around his own heart a wall in which no one had ever found the door. And in the autumn of 1856, that man heard a piece of gossip at his club in York. He heard it idly, between hands of cards, from a man who thought it a fine joke. He heard that the Foss family was ruined. He heard that the daughter, the Foss girl, someone said vaguely, the clever one, the one who never married, was to be sold off at a vulgar auction got up by Crispin Vane to settle her father's debts. He heard it spoken of as an amusement, a thing one might attend for sport. He did not finish his drink. He did not say a word. He rose and ordered his carriage and went to Harrogate. He had no plan, which was unlike him. He had only a single scouring certainty that had burned away 16 years of careful silence in the space of one overheard sentence, that whatever else happened in that assembly room, Crispin Vane was not going to be permitted to own her. So now you have them both. The woman with her trap, who needed only to reach the floor and speak, and the man with his 16 years of silence, who arrived with nothing but money and resolve, knowing only that he could not let the wrong man win, and never once imagining that she had a plan of her own, or that his presence would very nearly, which brings us back to that cold assembly room and the night everything turned. And I will tell you now, so that you listen closely to what follows. Everything you are about to watch unfold went wrong, not for the villains, for her. The best-laid plan of the cleverest woman in Yorkshire came apart in her hands in the space of 90 seconds, in front of 50 people, and what she did in those 90 seconds is the reason there is a story to tell at all. Watch carefully. It happens fast. The Harrogate rooms were full. Word had spread, exactly as Annabel had known it would, and the gentry had come in their finery to witness a respectable family's disgrace and to assure one another that they came only out of concern. candlelight glittered off jewels and off the rims of glasses. Mr. Josiah Pell stood near the front, with his ledger of debts, ready to confirm the sums. Crispin Vane stood beside him, magnificent in dark blue, accepting the murmured greetings of men who feared and flattered him. And Sir Reginald Foss sat slumped in a chair to one side, grey-faced and shaking, a man being made at last to understand the full size of what his weakness had purchased. Annabel stepped onto the raised step at the front, and the murmur died. She wore grey. She had chosen it with deliberation, not the white of an innocent, nor the black of a mourner, but the plain grey of a governess, of a woman who works, of a woman who is asking the room for nothing. Her hair was simply dressed. Her hands were steady, and in a small reticule, at her wrist she carried 4 years of her father's accounts, copied out in her own hand, every name, every date, every sum, the whole architecture of the ruin these men believed they had built in secret. The plan was simple, and it was good. She would allow the auction to begin. She would let Vane and Pell establish before all these witnesses that they were trafficking in a woman to settle a debt. And then, before the thing could be concluded, she would step forward and read aloud from the accounts, exposing the usury, exposing how Vane had purchased the debt to engineer this very night, laying the whole rotten transaction bare before the one tribunal these men truly feared. Not the law. The law would do nothing. But their own society, in a world where reputation was the only real currency, that society she could turn against them. She would make it impossible for them ever again to be received as gentlemen. She had no illusion it would restore her fortune, but it would burn theirs to the ground, and it would do so in a manner that left her, for the first time in her life, the author of her own story rather than a line in another man's ledger. She drew her breath to begin. And then the bidding opened, and the Duke of Hawthorne walked into the back of the room, and Annabel Foss felt the floor shift beneath her carefully laid scheme. The auctioneer, a man Vane had hired for his loud voice and his absent conscience, opened with a few oily words about the settling of accounts among gentlemen and invited offers. Vane had arranged even this. A confederate near the front called out an opening bid, a degrading £500 designed to fix the low and humiliating floor from which Vane would presently rise as saviour. 1,000, called Vane, smiling, and the room turned to him, as he had known it would. This was nearly her moment. One breath more. Let him commit himself fully before the witnesses. Let the thing be undeniable. 2,000, said a low voice from the back of the room. The room turned again. Annabel's eyes, against every intention, moved from the water stain above the door to the source of that voice, and found a tall man in dark, severe clothing standing just inside the entrance, a pale scar down one cheek, his face entirely without expression. She did not know him, but she knew with the swift instinct of a woman who had spent her life reading rooms that this was a man the others feared. She saw it in the way they drew back from him. She heard someone whisper, "Hawthorne," and another voice hiss, "The Duke." The War Duke. What in God's name is he doing here? And she understood that something had entered her careful equation that she had not put there and could not control. Vane's smile tightened at the corners. 2,500, he said. 3,000, said the Duke, without inflection, as though the figures bored him. And now Annabel faced a swift and silent crisis, there on her step, behind her composed face. Her plan required her to interrupt before the sale concluded, but it also required the room to understand this as an act of trafficking, a degradation, a thing decent people ought to be ashamed to witness. And this stranger, this Duke, was wrecking that, not cruelly, but utterly. He was not bidding like a man buying a degraded woman. He was bidding like a man at Tattersall's, purchasing a horse he had already decided to own, with a cold finality that was transforming the room's discomfort into something else, into spectacle, into the thrilling sense that they were watching a contest between two powerful men. If she stepped forward now, she would be interrupting not a sordid little crime, but a glamorous duel, and her revelations would land not as an indictment, but as the hysterics of a woman caught between two suitors. The Duke was, without the faintest idea that he was doing it, stealing the very meaning of her own ruin out from under her. I want you to sit with how cruel that irony is. This man had come to save her, and in coming, he was destroying the only weapon she had. 3,500, snapped Vane, and there was real anger in it now, the anger of a man watching a sure thing slip between his fingers. The Duke did not even look at him. He was looking at Annabel. He had been looking at her, she realized, since the moment he entered, not the way the others looked, with appetite or pity, but with a steadiness that asked nothing and gave nothing away. The look of a man confirming that something he had carried a very long time was still there, still real, still standing in the world. It unsettled her more than all the leering in the room combined. 4,000, said the Duke of Hawthorne, a sum that silenced the room. A sum that was, everyone present understood, simply more than Crispin Vane could match without exposing the rot at the foundation of his own finances. A rot that Annabel, alone in that room, knew to be real, because she had seen it in her father's accounts. Vane's mouth opened. Vane's mouth closed, and in the awful pause, Annabel watched the calculation move behind his eyes, watched him arrive, with visible, strangling fury at the only answer available to a man unwilling to ruin himself in public. Silence. 4,000 pounds, quality, crowed the auctioneer. To his grace the Duke of Hawthorne, going once, going twice. And here, my friends, is the moment everything turned upon. Because Annabel Foss had perhaps 3 seconds in which to make a decision that would define the rest of her life, and she made it the way she made all her best decisions, with her mind moving faster than her fear. Her plan was ruined in its original form. The auction was no longer a tableau of degradation she could expose. It had become a contest she had appeared to lose or win, depending on who was telling it. To step forward now and denounce the room would be to denounce the one man who had just spent 4,000 pounds to keep her from Vane's hands, and she did not yet know why he had done it. A woman who does not understand a player does not move against him blindly. But the documents in her reticule were still real. The truth was still the truth. And she understood in those 3 seconds that her revenge did not require this exact room on this exact night. It required only that she survive with her weapon intact, and her wits, and her terrible patient knowledge. So she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She did nothing. She let the word fall. Sold. She let them believe she was sold, and behind her frozen face she thought with cold and absolute clarity, I still have the ledgers. I have only changed which night the reckoning comes. The aftermath was swift and strange. Vane departed in a fury barely contained by the manners he wore like armour, pausing only to fix Annabel with a look that promised this was not finished. She met his eyes and let him see nothing at all, which frightened him more than defiance would have, though he would not have been able to say so. Pell scuttled out after his patron. The gentry dispersed into the wet night, alight with the finest gossip Yorkshire had seen in a decade. And Sir Reginald Foss wept in his chair. Whether from relief or shame or merely brandy, Annabel could no longer bring herself to wonder. The Duke of Hawthorne came forward. Up close, he was larger than he had seemed, and somehow quieter, and the scar on his face was older than she had thought, and his eyes, when they met hers, were not cold at all. They were terrified. She saw it plainly and did not understand it. "Miss Foss," he said. His voice was low and even, but she heard the effort beneath the evenness, the way a still surface tells you nothing of the current underneath. I imagine you have a great many questions, and I imagine you trust me not at all. You are correct not to. But I must tell you one thing before anything else, because everything that follows depends upon your believing it." He paused, and the most powerful man in the room seemed for a moment to have to gather his courage like an ordinary frightened person. "You are not bought. Whatever was transacted in this room tonight has bought nothing. The money is paid. Your father's debts to Vane and Pell may be settled out of it, and you owe me nothing whatsoever in return. Not gratitude, not your hand, not your presence for a single hour longer than you choose to give it. If you walk out that door tonight and never speak to me again, the money stands, and you are free. I have purchased your freedom, Miss Foss, and I am handing it to you, here, now, with no string upon it that you cannot cut yourself. That is all I have purchased. That is the whole of it." Annabel Foss, who had walked into that room with a plan and watched it shatter and rebuilt it in 3 seconds, found herself, for the first time in a very long while, without a single word to say. Because she had prepared for cruelty, she had prepared for appetite, she had prepared for the smooth, false kindness of men like Vane, who give in order to bind. She had not prepared for this. She had not prepared for a powerful man to spend £4,000 and then immediately and deliberately give away every particle of power it should have bought him. "Why?" she said at last, and it came out, not as a question, but as an accusation, low and hard. "Would any man on earth do such a thing?" And the Duke of Hawthorne looked at her with 16 years in his face and said very simply, "Because I have known what you are since we were children, and I could not stand in that room and watch a man who does not know it pretend to own you. That is the whole of my reason. It is not a claim upon you. It is only the truth. You may do with it whatever you like." He bowed. He laid a card upon the table beside her, the direction of his solicitor, so that the matter of the debts might be settled properly, and she need never rely on his word alone for any part of it. And then he walked out into the rain, leaving Annabel Foss standing in the emptying assembly room with a reticule full of vengeance, a head full of confusion, and the deeply unfamiliar sensation of having been, for once in her life, surprised by a man in a manner that did not end in injury. She did not trust it. Of course she did not trust it. She had not survived 4 years of watching wolves by mistaking one for a sheep merely because it had spoken gently. A man who gave away power so theatrically might simply be playing a longer and subtler game than Vane's. And Annabel resolved, standing there in the candle smoke, that she would accept nothing, assume nothing, and verify everything. But she would be lying to herself. And Annabel Foss did not lie to herself if she did not admit that something had shifted in her chest when he said, "I have known what you are since we were children." Because she had spent her whole life being seen as a problem, a burden, a possession, a debt to be discharged. And no one, not once, not ever, had said to her that they had seen what she was. She kept the card. She told herself it was only so that she might verify the business of the debts. But she kept it, and that night she did not sleep, and the not sleeping had nothing to do with Crispin Vane. Now, before we go on, I have to pause and tell you something. Because this next part is the part I rewrote more times than any other in this whole story. It would have been so easy, you see, to let her simply fall into his arms, to let the grand gesture do all the work, the way these stories so often do. But that is not who she was, and it is not how trust is truly built between two wary people who have each survived by trusting no one. What happened between Annabel Foss and the Duke of Hawthorne over the months that followed was not a swooning surrender. It was a negotiation. It was an audit. And it began, fittingly, with her refusing to be grateful. She went to his solicitor first, not to him. This was deliberate. She wished to know the truth of the man before she ever again stood in the same room as his face, which she had already learned was a face that did dangerous things to her composure. The solicitor was a dry and elderly gentleman named Mr. Trevane, and he set the whole of the settlement before her without protest when she asked, and watched with slowly warming respect as she read every line of it with the eye of a woman who had kept ledgers for 4 years. She found it exactly as the Duke had promised. The obligations to Pell purchased outright and forgiven. The portions Vane had acquired bought back at a premium that must have galled Vane bitterly to accept. And nowhere, not in a clause, not in a codicil, not buried in any careful lawyer's phrasing, anything that bound her to the Duke in any particular whatsoever. "His Grace said you would check the figures yourself," Mr. Trevane remarked when she had finished. "He said it would be the very first thing you did. He seemed to find the prospect agreeable." "And does His Grace find a great many things about me agreeable that he has imagined from a distance?" Annabel asked coolly, not looking up from the page. "I could not say, Miss Foss." A pause, dry as old paper. "Though I have been his man of business these 11 years, and I have never once heard him speak of any living person the way he does not speak of you, if you take my meaning." She took his meaning. She did not thank him for it. But she folded the settlement away very carefully, and her hands were not quite steady, and she noticed that they were not, and she filed that fact away, too, with all the others, to be examined later when she was alone. Their first real conversation took place a fortnight after that, and she arranged it entirely on her own terms, which the Duke, to his great credit and her grudging surprise, did not contest by so much as a word. She wrote to him. She proposed they meet in daylight in the public gardens at Harrogate, where she might come and go precisely as she pleased and be seen by anyone who passed. She informed him in her letter, prepared to hear whatever he wished to say. But he was to understand that she came as a free woman, owing him nothing, exactly as he himself had insisted, and that she would walk away the instant he gave her the smallest cause. She half expected him to be wounded by the coldness of it. Instead, he wrote back a single line, in that careful hand she would come to know so well. "Those are precisely the right terms, and I am glad you were the one to set them." They walked the gravel paths between the bare autumn beds, two careful people at a careful distance, the gardens grey and dripping around them and entirely deserted, for no one else was fool enough to walk out in such weather. And he told her things, not all at once, but over that meeting and the many that followed, and she arranged everyone, always in the open, always a thing she could end at will. The wall he had built around himself revealed its single hidden door, and the door, she came slowly to understand, was her. He told her about the boy in the corner at the children's party, and the larger boy in the mud, and the thing that had turned over in his chest when a 6-year-old girl stood up undefeated and told the truth to a room. He told her about the war, haltingly, the way men of that generation told it when they told it at all, about the cold and the waste, and the friends who had reached for the things they loved and lost them in an instant, and the lesson he had drawn out of all that frozen horror, which was to reach for nothing, ever, and so never be made to watch it taken. He told her that he had heard of her ruin at his club, and had risen without finishing his drink, and that he had ridden to Harrogate with no plan in the world beyond the one intolerable fact that Crispin Vane was not going to be allowed to own her. "You keep saying that," Annabel observed on a grey afternoon, by a fountain gone still and brown with fallen leaves, "that he was not to own you, as though ownership were the only danger in the world. But you might simply have paid the debt quietly, through Trevane, and let me go free without ever showing your face. You did not have to stand up in that room and bid against him before the entire county. Why did you?" The Duke was silent for a long moment, A blackbird moved in the bare hedge beside them, and somewhere far off a church bell counted the hour. "Because," he said at last, "if I had paid it quietly, you would never have known that you had been seen. You would have gone on, free and safe, and believing to the end of your days that not one soul in all the world had ever truly looked at you and known your worth." He glanced at her and away, his jaw tight with the cost of the honesty. "And I found when it came to the moment that I could not bear it. It was selfish, in its way, the most selfish thing I have ever done. You did not need to be seen by me. You needed only to be free. But I needed you to know that you had been seen. I have reproached myself for it many times since. I will reproach myself to you, and ask your pardon if you wish it." "I do not wish an apology," Annabel said slowly, watching his profile. "I wish to understand you. They are not the same thing, and I will not have one stand in for the other. And there, my friends, is the moment I want you to hold on to, because it is the truest thing in this entire story. She did not begin to soften toward him because he was charming, or rich, or wounded, or romantic in the manner of a novel. She set out to understand him, the way she understood a ledger, the way she understood everything, completely and on her own terms, reserving all judgment until the accounts were proven true. The Duke had handed her his whole heart in that assembly room, but Annabel Foss was not a woman who accepted a thing simply because it was offered to her. She intended to audit it, line by line, before she signed her name to anything. What she found, across those careful winter weeks, was a man whose every claim proved true the moment she tested it. And test it she did. She had spent 4 years learning exactly how information moved through Yorkshire society, which servants talked, which tradesmen listened, which matrons could not hold a secret past Sunday. And she turned the whole of that knowledge to the quiet business of watching him. She wished to know whether he spoke of her elsewhere, as he spoke to her in the gardens. She wished to know whether the gentleness was a face he wore for her and put off in company. And he came back clean. He never spoke of her ruin to a living soul. He never appeared uninvited. He never once used his rank to press where she had asked him not to go. There came a day by the fountain when she tested him outright, because she had learned long ago that a thing untested is a thing untrusted. "Suppose," she said, watching him very closely, "that I were to take my settled name and the freedom you have given me and go. Suppose I left Yorkshire altogether, took rooms in Bath or Edinburgh, somewhere you could not find me, and never wrote and never explained. What would you do?" He did not hesitate, and that was the thing she never forgot, that he did not hesitate. "I would have Trevane ensure you travelled safely," he said, "and that whatever portion you required was settled wholly in your own name, beyond any reach of mine, and then I would not trouble you again, not by letter, not in person, not ever." He looked out across the still water. "And I would count the £4,000 the best money I have spent in my life, because it would have bought the one thing I have wanted since I was 11 years old, which is for you to be free to choose your own road, even if the road led directly away from me." She believed him. That was the dangerous part. She had become entirely certain that he meant every word, and certainty was a thing she did not give cheaply. It was on the walk back from the gardens that afternoon, the light already failing, the cold coming down off the moors, her gloved hand resting on his offered arm for the first time because the path was slick with ice, and he had offered it without a word, and she had taken it without quite deciding to, that she became aware of him the way the stories never quite managed to describe, not as a duke, not as a benefactor, as a man close beside her in the blue winter dusk, his shoulder a hand's breadth from hers, the warmth of his arm coming through 2 layers of wool, his breath clouding the air in time with her own. She was aware of the exact distance between them as though it had been drawn on a map. And she understood with the same cold clarity she brought to everything that she was in a great deal more trouble than Crispin Vane had ever posed. She did not speak of it, neither did he. But at the gate she let her hand rest on his arm a moment longer than the ice required, and she felt him go very still beside her, the way a man goes still when he is afraid to frighten away something he has waited his whole life to see, and neither of them said one word about it, and both of them knew. But this is not, you will remember, only a story of two careful people learning to trust each other across a winter. It is also a story of revenge. And while Annabel Foss was auditing the heart of a duke, she had not for one single moment forgotten the reticule full of ledgers, nor the two men who had tried to sell her, nor the cold promise in Crispin Vane's eyes as he stalked out of the assembly room. Because here is the thing the men of Yorkshire had failed to understand, the thing they would all understand far too late. Annabel had not lost at that auction. She had merely been interrupted. The reckoning had not been cancelled. It had only been rescheduled. And now she possessed something she had not had before: time and safety, and a precise knowledge of exactly how thin Crispin Vane's fortune truly was. The matter came to a head on a cold afternoon at the Duke's estate, for she had by then begun to visit it, always announced, always on her own terms, the visits arranged by her and endurable to her precisely because she controlled them. He had learned, by then, the full shape of what Vane had done, how he had bought up the debt to engineer the auction, how he had meant to use her ruin to force her into his power. And Annabel watched the Duke go very still in the way she had learned, meant his banked rage was at its hottest, stiller than stone, his scar gone white against his cheek, and he said in a flat and terrible voice she had not heard from him before, "Give me leave, and I will destroy him. Entirely. Within the season. I have the means, and I have, God help me, the desire, and I have only been waiting for your word, because it is not my place to take it without you." And Annabel said no. "He is mine," she said, "not yours. You bought my freedom, your grace, and I am grateful for it, whether or not I have ever said so plainly, and I have not, and I know I have not. But you did not buy my revenge, and you will not take it from me the way every other man in my life has taken every other thing from me, however kindly you mean it. Crispin Vane is my reckoning. I have been keeping his account for 2 years in my own hand. I will be the one to close it." The Duke looked at her for a long, long moment, and then, and this, Annabel would say to the very end of her days, was the precise moment she stopped auditing him and began, against every careful resolution she had made, to love him. He inclined his head, the way a man inclines his head to a thing he respects, and he said, "Then tell me how I may be of use to you, and not a single step further than you ask. Here is how she closed the account. And I am going to tell it to you in full, because she had earned the telling of it in full, and because you have waited as patiently as she did." Annabel understood, as Vane never had, that his entire position rested upon an illusion. He lived as a man of fortune, but his fortune was a structure of debt and bluff, propped up by the very same usurious arrangements with Pell that had destroyed her father. Worse, for him, he had overextended himself badly in his scheme to acquire her. He had borrowed against his own expectations to buy up Sir Reginald's debt, gambling that ownership of Annabel would somehow be made to pay him back. When the Duke outbid him, that gamble collapsed in an instant, and Vane was left holding nothing but his own borrowings and the bitter knowledge that he had spent money he did not have to lose a prize he had never owned. He was, in short, exactly as vulnerable as she herself had once been. And Annabel knew precisely where the pressure wanted applying, because she had 4 years of records showing exactly how Pell's web was strung, and she understood the one truth on which the whole of it depended, that a moneylender's loyalty extends precisely as far as his security, and not 1 inch beyond. She did not need the Duke's fortune for this. She needed only his name and his willingness to lend it to a single quiet conversation, every word of which she wrote herself. At her direction, and only at her direction, the Duke of Hawthorne paid a call upon Mr. Josiah Pell. He did not threaten. That was the elegance of it, the elegance Annabel had built into every line. He merely observed in the mild and pleasant tone of a very powerful man making idle conversation over a glass of the moneylender's best port, that he had lately taken an interest in the affairs of the Foss family, that he would be most interested to learn the full extent of Mr. Crispin Vane's borrowings, should such information happen to be available, and that he wondered aloud, turning the glass to the firelight, admiring the colour, whether a prudent man of business might not, on the whole, prefer the certain and continuing custom of a duke to the uncertain custom of an overextended younger son whose expectations had lately come to nothing. It was not a threat. It did not need to be. Pell, who had served nothing but his own security his whole life long, understood the arithmetic before the Duke had finished his port. A duke was a fountain that would never run dry. Vane was a man on the edge of a cliff, and within the week Mr. Josiah Pell had quietly, regretfully, and entirely of his own apparent free will, called in the whole of Crispin Vane's debts. And Crispin Vane, who had spent 2 patient years engineering another person's ruin, discovered what it was to be ruined himself in the space of a single fortnight, not by a duke's brute power, by the precise application of his own methods turned back upon him by a woman he had been too arrogant ever to fear. His creditors descended. His bluff was called the moment he could not meet Pell. The structure of debt and appearance that had passed for a fortune came apart in his hands like wet paper, and the same Yorkshire society that had laughed so comfortably at Annabel's downfall now turned its appetite upon his, with the special savouring cruelty it reserved for a man who had presumed above his means and been caught at it. But Annabel was not finished. And this, my friends, is the part she had planned from the very first, the part the assembly room had stolen from her, the part she had waited all those careful months to reclaim. Because ruining Vane in his purse was not enough, she meant to take back the very night he had tried to take from her. When Vane was at the lowest ebb of his ruin, when the gossip was at its height and the gentry were gathered at a great winter assembly, a glittering, crowded affair, very like the one at which he had tried to sell her, Annabel Foss walked to the front of the room. She was not invited to speak. She was not announced. She simply walked, in her plain grey gown, through a crowd that fell silent and parted before her in pure astonishment, up to the very front of the assembly where the light was brightest and the whole county could see her. Vane was there. She had made certain he would be there. He stood near the wall with the hunted look of a man whose creditors are closing, and when he saw her come forward his face went the colour of ash. She took from her reticule the ledger, her own copy, 4 years in the making, in her own neat, unanswerable hand. And she read. She did not rage. That was the thing that made it unanswerable, the thing Vane could never have defended against, because he had armoured himself entirely against a woman's tears and a woman's fury, and had no armour at all against a woman's arithmetic. She read in a clear, carrying, perfectly level voice, the voice of a woman reading out a list of facts because the facts were sufficient. She read the dates on which Josiah Pell had advanced money to a grieving man at rates she then stated to the farthing, and let the room do its own appalled reckoning. She read the dates on which Crispin Vane had purchased her father's debt from Pell in careful instalments over 2 long years. Reading them slowly, one after another, so that every soul in that room understood that this had not been chance, had not been rescue, had been a campaign. She read the record of the auction Vane himself had proposed, and named it for what it was. And when a man near the back called out, his voice cracking with the need to break her, "And who is to say these are not a bitter spinster's inventions?" Annabel lifted her eyes from the page and said, without heat, "Mr. Pell is standing by the door. He has the originals. You may ask him whether my figures are correct. I will wait." And every head turned to Josiah Pell, who stood frozen by the door with the eyes of the entire county upon him, and who, faced with the choice between confessing to usury and calling a duke's particular friend a liar to her face before the whole of Yorkshire, did the only thing a man who serves his own security can do. He said nothing. He looked at the floor, and his silence was louder than any confession could have been. Annabel closed the ledger. The sound of it carried in the absolute stillness of the room. She looked out over them all, the matrons who had tittered behind their fans, the gentlemen who had come to watch her sold for sport, the whole comfortable, cruel, watching county that had decided long ago exactly what she was worth and exactly how little it owed her. And she said in a voice that did not shake, "You came, all of you, to watch me sold. I have only thought you ought to know what it was you were buying. Good evening." And she turned, and she walked the length of that silent room, and the crowd parted before her again, and she went out into the night. Crispin Vane was finished in Yorkshire from that hour, not because a duke had crushed him, though the duke could have, and gladly, but because a woman he had dismissed as a competent. Nobody had kept careful count of every cruelty, and had chosen, with great patience, the precise hour at which to present him the bill. He left the county before the spring. I am told he went abroad. Annabel never troubled to learn where, which was, when you understand her, the most complete contempt she could possibly have shown him. He had ceased entirely to be a figure in her accounts. Her father, I should tell you, she did not destroy, though she had every means and every right. Sir Reginald Foss had been a weak man and a ruinous one, and he had failed her in every way a father can fail a daughter. But she had spent 4 years watching him drown, and she found, when the reckoning came at last, that she had no appetite to put her hand on his head and push him under. She settled him in a modest cottage on the edge of the moors, with a small annuity arranged through Trevane. Enough to keep him from the gaming tables, not enough to keep him in the company that would tempt him back to them. It was not forgiveness. It was something colder than forgiveness, and more durable. The deliberate choice of a woman who had finally gathered enough power to decide, for herself, what she would and would not do with it. She called on him sometimes. They never spoke of the auction. There are some accounts that cannot be balanced, only set quietly aside. And the Duke? Here is where I must tell you about the letters, because Annabel found them, and they changed the final shape of everything. It happened in the early spring, nearly a year after the auction, when she had at last, on her own terms, after her own long deliberation, with all the wariness of a woman who trusts nothing she has not personally proven, agreed to see the full truth of his house, not as a guest with any understanding between them, as a woman looking at last upon the whole life of the man whose heart she had spent half a year auditing. He showed her the house himself, room by room, in the particular shy pride of a man showing his world to the one person whose opinion of it he cannot survive. And in his study he was called away a moment by his steward, and Annabel, being who she was, being a woman who read everything, let her eyes fall upon a drawer that stood very slightly open in his great desk. I want to be clear, because it matters to who she was. She did not rifle through his things like a thief. She saw a corner of paper, she saw a date in a hand she had come to know, and she eased the drawer open the width of a hand, and she went entirely still. The drawer was full of letters, dozens of them, every one addressed to her, Miss Annabel Foss, in the Duke's own careful writing. And not one of them had ever been sent. She lifted the topmost. It was dated 9 years before. "I saw you today at the Harrogate Fair," it began, "and you were laughing at something your friend had said, and I stood across the green and could not make myself cross it. I have written this letter 100 times in my mind. I will not send this one either. But I find I cannot stop writing them, even unsent, even to no one at all, because there is something in me that needs the words to exist somewhere outside my own silence." She lifted another and another. They spanned the years. They followed her life from a great distance. Small things she had said at parties he had attended and at which she had never once noticed him. The winter her mother died, when he had written, "I wanted to come to you and had no right, and so I write this instead and burn with the uselessness of it." The spring she had worn a green ribbon, which he had noticed and recorded and treasured, as though a ribbon were a relic. They were not, she understood as she read them, the letters of a man building a claim. They were the letters of a man who had loved across a distance he believed uncrossable, and who had survived the loving by pouring it into pages he never meant another living soul to read. This was the proof, if you like, of how long and how deeply he had loved her, the evidence laid bare in his own hand. And here is the thing I most want you to sit with, because it is the place where this story refuses, finally, to be the story you might have expected. Annabel Foss, standing there with 9 years of unsent letters in her 2 hands, did not melt. She did not turn, her eyes shining, to find him in the doorway and fall against his chest while the music swelled. She felt a great many things at once, and they were complicated, and not every one of them was comfortable. She was moved, profoundly, to the very floor of herself. But she also felt the faint cold breath of something that troubled her, and that she was too honest to pretend away. That a man had watched her for 9 years, had marked the small private details of her days, had loved her at such length and in such detail, and she had never once known. There was a kind of unease in that, to be so seen, so long, so silently, by a person you cannot see in return. And Annabel, being honest with herself as she always was, did not pretend the unease was not there. When the Duke returned and saw the open drawer and the letters in her hands, he went white and then very still, and he did not try to explain or to excuse or to soften. He said only, "I never meant for you to see those. I have wronged you by writing them, perhaps. A man should not watch a woman so for so long and say nothing to her of it, and give her no chance to refuse being watched. You have every right in the world to be troubled by them. I will not tell you how to feel about a thing I did in silence, and never once gave you the power to refuse." And Annabel looked at him for a long, long moment. And then she said the thing that made me certain, when I first wrote it, that this was the story I wanted to tell you. "They trouble me," she said, honestly, evenly. "I will not pretend they do not, and I am glad you do not ask me to. To be watched so long and never to know it, it is not a small thing, and I do not think you ought to have done it, and the fact that you do not pretend otherwise is the only thing that makes it bearable." She set the letters down, carefully, in their order, the way she set down anything she respected. "But I have spent the better part of a year learning the difference between a man who loves a woman and a man who wishes to own one. Crispin Vane wrote me no letters. Vane simply built a cage and called it devotion and waited for me to walk into it grateful. You built no cage at all. You spent £4,000 and a very great deal of your pride to set me free and ask nothing, and then, when I came at last to your house, you did not even hide these away to spare yourself. You left the drawer open. You let me find you out." She drew a breath. "So I will tell you what I have decided. because I decide these things for myself now, and I will decide them for myself for the rest of my life, and any man who means to stand near me had best make his peace with that on the first day. The watching troubles me, the man does not. And if you can hold both of those truths at once, if you can understand that I am grateful and uneasy in the same breath, and not ask me to choose between them to make yourself more comfortable, then we may go on, slowly, on my terms, exactly as we have done from the first. The Duke of Hawthorne, who had loved her for 16 years and never once been answered, did the only thing a man like that could do in the face of a woman like that. He understood. He inclined his head the way he had the day she told him Vane was hers to ruin and not his. "On your terms," he said, "as we have always done. I would not have it any other way. I find, when I am honest, that I never have." It was then, and only then, with the letters between them and the truth said plainly and nothing pretended away, that he crossed the room to her. He stopped a careful pace away, close enough that she could have stepped back if she wished, and he waited, because he was a man who had learned to wait, and he let her see him wait. And Annabel Foss, who had controlled every meeting between them, who had arranged every encounter so that she might end it at will, looked at the careful distance he had left her, the distance that was hers to close or to keep, and understood that he had left it on purpose, that the choice, as it had always been with him, was entirely her own. So she closed it. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like the violent claiming the stories so often promise. It was slow, and it was careful, and it asked rather than took, and when at last she drew back, his eyes were closed, and his breath was unsteady, and he looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who had set down a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten its name. "You see," she said softly, and there was the smallest smile in it, the first he had ever been given. "I told you. On my terms." "On your terms," he agreed a little hoarsely. "Always. But I would be telling you a lie and a poorer story if I let you believe the road ran smooth from that kiss to the altar. It did not. And I want to tell you what nearly broke them, because it is the part of the tale that proves what they were to each other, since anything will hold in fair weather, and only the true thing holds in the storm. It came, as these things so often do, from her oldest wound, and not from any new one. A fortnight after the kiss, the gossip began to turn. Yorkshire society, having watched Crispin Vane destroyed and the Foss girl walk untouched out of an assembly room she had set alight, had arrived at the only conclusion its narrow imagination could supply, that the clever, ruined Miss Foss had played a deep game from the first, had baited a trap with her own disgrace, and had caught herself a duke in it. They did not say she had been wronged. They said she had been cunning. They said, and the word reached her, as such words always reach the person they are sharpened for, that his grace had been managed, that a fortune-hunting spinster with a head for figures had reckoned the angles and reeled him in, and that the war had left the poor man too solitary to see the hook. It should not have wounded her. She knew precisely what she was and precisely what she was not. But here is the cruelty of an old wound. It does not ask whether the new blow is fair. It only knows where to land. For her whole life, Annabel had been told what she was worth by people who had never once troubled to know her. A burden, a debt, a competence to be used. And now, when at last she had taken her own life into her own two hands, the same voices had found a way to make even that into something small and grasping. They had taken the one clean thing she had ever done and named it a scheme. And a colder fear came in behind the wound, the way cold air follows a door left open. What if they were right about him? Not that she had schemed, she knew she had not. But what if she had let a frightened, solitary man, marked by a war and starved of any softness for 16 years, mistake rescue for love? What if she married him, and the strangeness of her wore off, and he woke one morning beside a woman he had built entirely out of 16 years of longing, and found her to be merely a person, and ordinary, and not the girl from the corner of a children's party at all? She had audited his heart, but she had never once stopped to ask whether the thing he loved was her, or only the long, bright idea of her he had carried through the dark. So she did the thing she had always done when the world grew too large to control. She took back the only ground that was ever truly hers. She wrote to him, not in the gardens, not in person, but in a cold, short letter that cost her more than she would ever tell him. And she told him she could not see him for a time, that she needed to be certain she came to him free, and not merely grateful, and not merely cornered by a county that had decided her future for her once again. That if what was between them was real, it would survive her absence, and that if it could not survive her absence, then it was better broken now than after she had given it her name. I will not be managed into a marriage, she wrote, not even into a happy one. I have been managed enough for one life. Do not write to me. If I am to come to you, I must come of my own accord, from a distance, with no hand upon my back, or I cannot come at all. And then she went. She took rooms in York, alone, with the small independent portion Trevane had settled in her own name. The very freedom the Duke had bought her, turned now to the purpose of walking away from him. It was the cruelest possible use of his gift, and she knew it, and she did it anyway, because she had to know. I have to pause here, because this is the part that I found hardest to write, and the part I am most certain was right. It would have been easier, so much easier, to let her stay, to let love simply carry the day. But Annabel Foss had spent her whole life having her choices made by other people, and a woman like that, offered even the happiest of futures, must at least once make absolutely certain that she is choosing it, and not merely being swept into it by a current she did not start. She did not leave because she doubted him. She left because she had never once in 22 years been permitted to find out what she wanted when no one at all was watching, and she could not give herself to anyone until she had. Now, here is where a lesser man would have ruined everything. Here is where the Duke might have come after her. He knew where she was. A man of his means could have found her in a day. He might have arrived at her door in York, magnificent and wounded, and pleaded his case, and made her feel the full weight of all he had given her. And had he done so, he would have proved every cruel thing the gossip said, that she could be managed, that a great man's will was a current she could not swim against, that her freedom was a thing held on loan and revocable the moment she used it in a way that pained him. He did not come. He sat in his great cold house, and he did not come. And he did not write, because she had asked him not to, and he had learned in 16 years of silence the one hard discipline she most needed him to have. He knew how to want a thing terribly, and reach for nothing. But do not imagine, my friends, that it cost him little. His household watched him stop sleeping. Trevane, calling on business, found him grey and hollow and short of temper, the banked stillness gone ragged at the edges. He took to riding out, alone across the winter moors in weather that frightened his grooms, hours at a stretch, coming back soaked to the bone and saying nothing. Once, his steward found him standing in the study before the open drawer of unsent letters, simply looking at them, and withdrew without a word. He was a man who had taught himself that everything he loved would be taken the instant he reached for it, and now, at last, with the proof of it, living alone in rooms in York, he was being made to hold to that lesson on purpose, for her sake, when every cell in him was screaming to ride out and find her. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than the war, because in the war he had not been given the choice. Now the choice was his, every hour of every day, to go or to keep faith with what she had asked, and every hour of every day, he kept faith. He let her be free, though it was killing him by inches, because he had finally understood that letting her be free was the whole of what loving her meant. And Annabel, alone in York, suffered too. And this is the part the stories so often forget, that a woman who chooses solitude does not therefore find it easy. She had her freedom now, entire and untouched, and she discovered that freedom is a colder companion than she had imagined on the nights she had longed for it most. She walked the unfamiliar streets. She kept her own small accounts. She sat by her own small fire of an evening with no one's ledgers to keep, and no one's ruin to plan, and no duke across a frozen fountain asking her with terrible patience to understand him. And into that quiet, at last, the truth came. Not the truth she had gone looking for, but the truth underneath it. She had not left because she doubted him. She had left because she had been afraid. Afraid that something this good could not be real, afraid to want it openly in case it was taken, afraid in exactly the way he had been afraid for 16 years. She had spent half a year auditing his heart and never once turned the same merciless eye upon her own. And when she finally did, she found the figure she had been refusing to read. That she loved him, that she had loved him by the frozen fountain and on the icy path with her hand on his arm and across the open drawer of letters. That she had built her whole careful absence not to test his love but to flee her own. The not coming was what told her. Every day he did not appear at her door, every day no letter came, was a day he kept the one promise that mattered, the promise to leave the choosing to her. A lesser man's silence would have felt like indifference. His silence felt like the steadiest declaration he could possibly have made. I will not take this from you, not even to end my own pain. It is yours. It has always been yours. Come or do not come, but come freely or not at all. No grand gesture in all of England could have said what his stillness said. He was proving, in the only language she would have believed, that the thing he loved was not a bright idea of her he could possess. It was her, free, or it was nothing. She went back in the first week of spring. She did not write ahead. She simply came up the long drive in a hired carriage and was shown into the study where he stood at the window with his back to the door, gone still as he always went still, as though he did not dare to turn and find it was not her. And Annabel Foss, who had controlled every meeting they had ever had, set down the last of her control at the threshold and said to his unturned back, in a voice that was not quite steady, I have audited one last account, Your Grace, my own. I had refused to read it for a very long time, and I find the figures were true all along. She drew a breath. I came of my own accord, from a distance, with no hand upon my back, exactly as I said I must, or not at all. A pause. I have come. He turned then, and whatever 16 years of discipline had built in his face came down all at once, like a wall that has held against the sea one storm too many, and the man underneath it was simply a man who had been very much afraid and was not afraid any longer. He did not cross the room and seize her. Even then, he left her the last step to take, because he had learned what she was, and he would not unlearn it for anything. But his eyes told her everything his stillness had been holding through the long, cold weeks, and she crossed the floor, and this time it was she who did not leave a careful distance, and neither of them spoke for a good while after that. I would not come after you, he said at last, his voice rough against her hair. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. I wanted you to know that it was the hardest thing. I know, she said. That is precisely why I came back. A man who would have come after me is a man I could not have married. A man who could let me go is the only man on earth I would ever trust to keep. She drew back to look at him. Do you understand the difference? Because the whole of my life is in that difference. I understand it, he said. "I have understood it since you were 6 years old and stood up out of the mud and told a coward what he was. You have never once in your life needed rescuing, Annabel. You have only needed someone with the sense to know it." His thumb moved once across her cheek, careful as everything he did. "I have spent 16 years acquiring that sense. I should be very sorry to waste it now. And it was after that, only after that, after the leaving and the keeping faith and the coming back of her own free accord, that the swooning part you have been waiting for could honestly come at all. Now I know some of you wanted the great swooning declaration, the Duke upon his knees, the sweeping strings, the whole of it, and there was in the end a declaration. But it came from both of them, and it came only after she had taken the whole of that spring and the summer after it, to be entirely, unhurriedly sure. She did not marry him in haste to seal a romantic moment. She married him in the autumn that followed, 2 years near enough after she had stood upon that auction step in her plain grey gown, because she had audited his heart as thoroughly as she had ever audited any ledger in her life, and her own heart beside it, and had found every single figure true. And when she married him, she did so with a settlement. Let me tell you about that settlement, because it is, to me, the truest happy ending in the whole story, truer than the kiss, truer than the wedding itself. And let me tell it to you as it happened, in Trevain's chambers a week before the marriage, because the scene deserves the telling. Now, you must understand what a marriage settlement was, and why this one mattered so. I told you at the start of this story about coverture, the doctrine by which a wife, the instant she spoke her vows, ceased to exist in law as a separate person, and her every possession passed into her husband's hands. But the law of England was a stranger, older, more divided thing than that single cruelty suggests. Alongside the common law that swallowed a wife whole, there ran a second body of law, the law of equity, administered in separate courts, and equity, for those with the cleverness and the money to use it, permitted a thing the common law forbade. It permitted property to be settled upon trustees for a married woman's sole and separate use, held apart from her husband, beyond his reach, hers to command. It was the one door in the whole high wall of coverture, and it stood open only to those who knew it was there and had the means to walk through it. Most women never knew. Most women were never told. Annabel Foss had read of it, years before, in a law book she was not supposed to have opened, on a winter night when she could not sleep, and she had filed it away, as she filed everything, against a day she could not yet imagine. That day had come. And so, a week before her wedding, the future Duchess of Hawthorne sat across a desk from her own solicitor with a document she had largely drafted herself, and beside her sat the most powerful man in 3 counties, and she did not look at him at all. She looked at Trevain. "You will read him the clauses," she said, "everyone. I will not have it said ever by anyone that he did not know precisely what he signed. I have had enough of arrangements made in the dark over the heads of the people they bind." Read them aloud. And Trevain, dry as old paper and visibly torn between professional scandal and personal delight, read them aloud. He read the clauses that placed a substantial estate, and the income of it, and certain moneys besides, into the hands of trustees for the sole and separate use of Annabel, soon to be Duchess of Hawthorne, beyond her husband's control, beyond his creditors, beyond his power to touch or sell or command. He read the clause that gave her the disposing of it by her own hand, in life and in death, as though she were no man's wife at all, but a woman entire. He read, growing more scandalized with each line, the provision that should the marriage ever prove a thing she could not bear, the separate estate went with her, undiminished, no matter the cause or the blame. It was, he said, laying down the last page, most unusual. It was, he said, a settlement such as he had drawn perhaps twice in 40 years, and never for a duke, and never against a duke's own interest so completely. "His Grace will wish to consider it," Trevane said, looking at Hawthorne with something like warning. "These are not small concessions, Your Grace. You are signing away rights the law presses upon you. Most men in your position—" "I am not most men," said the Duke of Hawthorne, "and she is not most women, and that is the entire reason we are sitting in this room." He reached across the desk and drew the document toward him, and he did not read past the first page, and he took up the pen. "You ought to read it," Annabel said quietly. It was nearly the only thing she had said to him through the whole of it. He looked at her then, looked at her properly, for the first time since they had entered the chamber. "Annabel," he said, "you drew it. It will be correct. I have spent the better part of 2 years learning that there is no surer thing in England than a figure set down in your hand." And he signed his name, the great, sprawling, ducal signature, beneath hers, and set down the pen, and added, only to her, low enough that the scandalized Trevane pretended not to hear, "I have been trying since the night I met you to give you back to yourself. Let me finish doing it." And Annabel Foss, who had walked into an auction room to be sold and had walked out resolved to belong to no man living, looked down at the document that made her, in the eyes of the one law that could manage it, a married woman who yet remained entirely her own, and found that her eyes were not as dry as she would have liked, and that for once in her life she did not greatly mind, because the Duke of Hawthorne had understood from the very first night in that cold assembly room the one truth that every other man in Annabel's life had failed to grasp, that the only way to hold Annabel Foss was never, ever to try. The wedding itself was small, by ducal standards, and held at his estate rather than in any great public church, because she would not be made a spectacle a second time for the entertainment of a county. But the county came regardless, those of it she permitted. And they watched the ruined Foss girl, who had stood on an auction block in plain grey 2 years before, walk to the altar of her own free choosing in a gown, the colour of deep winter dusk, neither white nor black nor anyone's idea of what she ought to be, and they understood, every one of them, that they were watching not a rescue, but a reckoning concluded on the terms of the woman who had planned it. She became a duchess, and the same society that had gathered, glittering and cruel, to watch her sold now gathered, glittering and anxious, to bow to her. She accepted their bows with a cool and perfect courtesy that frightened them a great deal more than coldness ever could have, because every soul in that county knew, when they bent before the new Duchess of Hawthorne, that she remembered with perfect clarity exactly who had laughed, and exactly when, and exactly how loudly. She never once raised the matter. She never needed to. She had taught Yorkshire in the most thorough and unforgettable lesson it ever received, a single permanent fact, that Annabel Foss kept count, and that the keeping of count was not finished merely because the ledger had been closed. As for the man who had loved her longest, he spent the rest of his life learning, to his quiet and endless astonishment, that to be loved in return by a woman who had chosen it freely, audited it completely, and committed to it on her own deliberate terms, was a thing worth 16 years of silence and £4,000 and every single letter he had never sent. He went on writing her letters after they married. He never lost the habit of it, and she would not have wished him to. But now he gave them to her, into her own hand, the day he wrote them. And she read every one. And sometimes, when she had read one she particularly loved, she would write him an answer and leave it, with deliberate mischief, in the very drawer of the desk where she had first found the rest, so that he might have the strange new joy, after a lifetime of silence, of being the one to open a drawer and find himself at last answered. And that, my friends, is the story of the woman who was brought to an auction to be sold, and who walked out of it with her freedom in one hand and her vengeance in the other, and who took 2 careful years and the whole of her own deliberate judgment to decide that the man who had outbid everyone was worth the keeping. not because he had bought her, but because he was the one man in all of England who had ever understood that she could not be bought at all. So tell me, what would you have done in her place? Would you have trusted those letters? Or would they have troubled you as honestly as they troubled her? And do you think she was right to take her revenge with her own two hands, rather than let the Duke take it for her, however gladly he offered? I genuinely want to know, so leave me a comment below and tell me where in the world you are listening from while you do. I am already at work on the next story, and I will tell you only this much to tempt you. It begins with a woman in deepest mourning black, who is not nearly so grief-stricken as she appears, and a man who arrives at the funeral of a person he is entirely certain is still alive. Subscribe so that you do not miss it. Leave me a comment telling me what you made of Annabel and her ledgers, and I will see you again very soon. Until then, take good care of yourselves, and remember, the quiet ones are very often the ones keeping count.